Hi, my name is Megan Jameson, and this is my final presentation for Educating Exceptional Students, the summer of 2020. As a little bit of an introduction, students with disabilities are very common in classrooms nowadays, and students that have disabilities need to be felt or need to be made like they feel like they do not have a disability, more that it's an ability. Two organizations that are really prominent when it comes to educating exceptional students is the IDEA, which is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the act that essentially provides all students who have a disability with a fair education. And then the ADA, which is the American Disabilities Act. This act essentially is more for general public and making sure that businesses, schools, and other public places have access for people that may have a disability or are handicapped and need to be able to access those buildings. This includes ramps, elevators, and things of that nature. What counts as a disability? The IDEA has a lot of different disabilities that they do cover. However, there are different categories that each disability fits into. In order to qualify under IDEA, a student must have a disability and need a special education or a SPED because of it. They do end up having usually a social, cognitive, intellectual, or academic-based disability. And some of the disabilities that the IDEA does recognize are autism, deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairments, developmental delays, intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairments, other health impairments, which includes ADHD, one of the most common disabilities, specific learning disabilities such as dyslexia, speech and language impairments, traumatic brain injuries, visual impairments as well. What role do parents play? Parents have either the most important role or second most important role. The educator and the parents have probably the most important roles when it comes to students with disabilities, because the learning does not just stop at school. The learning continues on at home, and the more that a parent communicates with an educator about their student, the more that they can address certain issues that need to be addressed, or address certain issues that may be lacking in the student's education, which is really, really important. Autism. Autism is one of the most serious disabilities that a student can have and is one of the most noticeable to students' peers. Autism also gets a lot of public attention from different funding groups and the media. Actually, fun fact, April is Autism Awareness Month, and April 2nd is National Autism Day. When it comes to autism, autism reveals itself fairly early, around the age of 3, and has different effects. There are the verbal and nonverbal communication effects, there's the social interaction, and then also the academic performance. It is considered a developmental disability and is a spectrum disorder, which means there are varying differences in degrees of autism. Some language issues that come along with autism is echolalia, which is the repeating or echoing of another student's language, or of their own language for that matter. And different ways to help is to really involve the families and use social stories. Social stories are a great way to show students that what you want them to do, and like show them other kids doing it instead of you trying to verbally tell them what to do and then having them not process it the same way. And then also using a lot of self-directed strategies so the student feels like they're in control. Deafblindness. Deafblindness is when a student is both deaf and blind at the same time, causing a severe learning impairment. This one is making sure mostly that you have the resources ready and you are involving the families and using some of the techniques that are used at home in order to keep their home environment and their school environment consistent. This is really important, so having things like Braille is very necessary for a student that has combination deafblindness. Okay. Deafness and the effects in the classroom. Deafness is a severe hearing impairment that can either be developed or can occur at birth. Both types of deafness are severe and can limit a student's education in multiple ways. Hearing impairments, on the other hand, somewhat go hand in hand with deafness, but the severity is not as harsh. So when a student has a hearing impairment, they just might have a regular hearing aid, and sometimes you'll have to tune them or do other things with them. But deafness in itself is when a student tends to have a cochlear implant, as shown in the picture, or when a student just cannot hear. So having the resources for that student is really important. Using an interpreter, using sign language is also a great idea. Or some students learn to read lips and then can communicate that way and write things down when necessary. A developmental delay. Developmental delays can be any array of issues that affect a student's learning process. This includes physical, cognitive, communication skills, social, emotional, and behavioral development. Anything that essentially develops throughout a student's life and is delayed is a developmental delay. Emotional disturbances. Emotional disturbances means a student cannot maintain or build interpersonal communications with other students. They tend to develop physical symptoms and can develop moods that are consistent with sadness. And then they have an inability to learn, which means it is not based off of intellectual, sensory, or health base. Also, students tend to exhibit a lot of inappropriate behavior. Intellectual disabilities, on the other hand, occur in a classroom when the general intellectual function of an individual is subpar to the point of severity. The reason there's a bell curve on the screen right here is because students tend to be on the outer edges of those bell curves when it comes to their intellectual abilities. Essentially, that is what is being tested for when they do test for intellectual disabilities. Multiple disabilities occur when a student has one or more disabilities that coincide with each other. For example, an intellectual disability in deafness, or an intellectual disability in blindness, or intellectual disability in orthopedic disabilities. I used intellectual disabilities a lot as an example. That is not the only singular type of disability a student can be considered to have multiple disabilities. Orthopedic impairments. Orthopedic impairments is a really interesting one because orthopedic impairments are based off of physical impairments in the classroom. Like I said before, the ADA is where this mainly comes into play. This means making sure schools are safe and accessible for every student. So students that are in wheelchairs, on crutches, or need boots, or have the scooters of any type have to be accommodated for. So things like ramps going in and out of cafeterias, libraries, computer labs, making sure those things are on the first floor, having ramps at entrances and exits in and out of the school. Elevators have become really popular, especially in schools with younger children because they tend to break their bones a little bit more easily. Are all accommodations that the ADA has started instilling in all schools. This also can be things like bone tuberculosis, fractures and breaks, and cerebral palsy are the main examples of orthopedic impairments. Other health impairments. Other health impairments are impairments that tend to be based off of a chronic disability or an acute disease. This section does include ADHD for students who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And when it comes to students that have ADHD, really making sure that they play a role in their education and they are the ones that are feeling like they're responsible. So having self-regulated checks and having students have a checklist that have ADHD is a really great way to make them feel like they're in control of their own learning, but also allowing them to do what they need to do and get it done in a timely manner. Specific learning disabilities. Specific learning disabilities cover a really wide array of disabilities. This can include anything from dyslexia, which is the mixing up of letters when it comes to reading, or numbers when it comes to math, to a brain injury causing a later learning disability. I think it's really interesting that specific learning disabilities cover such a wide array, especially in the IDEA's definition of disabilities. Speech-language impairments. Speech and language impairments come in all shapes and sizes, and some are more common than others. A stutter is considered a speech or language impairment, but so is also the impaired articulation or a delay in a student's speech. These are all very common, and some may need a SPED program because of it. And usually that is when a speech-language pathologist comes in and tends to work with the students. TBIs or traumatic brain injuries. TBIs or traumatic brain injuries is a difficult disability for most students because it occurs during their lifetime and is not an injury or a disability that the students are born with, so they have to adjust. Students and athletes especially that tend to have multiple concussions tend to be students that have TBIs or traumatic brain injuries. Vision impairments. Vision impairments, as defined by the IDEA, are impairments that cannot be corrected with either lenses or glasses, and that will still impair the student's vision to the point where it affects them in the classrooms and their everyday life. It is not quite to the point of blindness, but it is also not correctable with a lens or any type of glasses. A teacher's role. Teachers play a really important role in students' lives anyways, but students who have disabilities, they set the tone for how students view school, whether they view it positively or whether they view it negatively. And that is something that is really huge. Also, teachers play a huge part in that student learning social skills because they are in their classroom to learn multiple social skills, not just learn the curriculum-based requirements. And I think that's really important that students keep keep students that have disabilities in their classrooms instead of sending them off into specific classes. The Universal Design of Learning, this is the graphic that is represented on the Universal Design of Learning guidelines. It mainly focuses on engagement, representation, and action and expression. So making sure that students have these different options to do things like self-regulate, or have different options to express and communicate to the teacher what they need and what they feel like they need. Very, very important. And the UDL is based off of more of a scientific-based learning. Differentiated learning. Differentiated learning is based mainly on learning styles that are used in the classroom commonly in order to include students in the classroom and help them feel like they are a part of the class. Differentiated learning includes using different learning methods, using different methods in your classroom when it comes to behavioral issues as well, in order to make sure students feel like they are involved and they have a say in their behavioral and their social like educations. Differentiated learning is the most common type of learning styles that we end up finding mainly in classrooms, especially with classrooms that include their students that have disabilities. That is all for my presentation, and thank you.